Hey guys, this is Neil Gewirtz with BluefirePoker.com, bringing you a session review video. This is a session I actually recorded a few months ago. Was planning on making a video out of it, and at the time decided not to. But I took a quick look at the hands, and it seemed like there was enough interesting footage to be worthy of making a video. I'll give you a quick setup here. It looks like I have labels and notes on basically everyone at the table. So I have decent reads on them, at least. Some good reads on the players, so it looks like I have over 1,000 hands on this player over here. As always, I'm going to be targeting the weaker opponents and just looking for kind of small things in the regs games to take advantage of, but really looking to get the most value out of these fishier opponents. And we see here on table 2, Queen 8 offsuit. I suppose I'm certainly always opening Queen 9. I'm probably folding Queen 7 offsuit, so Queen 8, somewhat of a tweener hand, but with the weaker players in the blinds, definitely an open. When I see bet here, it's one of those situations, if I get raised, it's a bit sticky. Our opponent is almost 50 big blinds deep. It's a little more money than you tend to want to put in with a top pair, no kicker type hand. But given that he's a fish, flush draws and straight draws are present, my likely course of action would be to call and look to get the money in on safe turns. Granted, there aren't a ton of safe turns. Any club, king, for sure. As well as Jack, 10, or Ace. None of these are particularly good cards for me. But I think there's enough value in betting and deciding, and likely, given that the opponent is so weak, I would really feel it hard-pressed to find a fold against a fish with top pair in a spot like that. So like I said, this footage is old. I certainly don't remember, very specifically a lot of these hands here. I'll go ahead and pause and check on what I do in each of these situations, and this will also be a little bit of a leak finder for myself to see if I agree with my play or not. I can't imagine too many other options on any of these hands, other than table 2. I would imagine I'm going to find a fold. Table 1, there is the option of isolating raising big. The couple of factors here are going to be, one, if I expect the big blind to play pretty straightforward, I will tend to want to see a flop of his hand, and two, I would have to expect to get a lot of folds from these fishier players behind me to want to raise here. Pocket fours, probably a hand which is like a 53% favorite against these players' ranges. The point being a very small favorite. It's not the type of equity edge that I want to push at all, though, given that it's a hand which really gains its profitability from flopping sets. If I do raise here, I'm going to feel obligated to c-bet a lot of flops, and given the fact of, say I make it $250, $3 pre-flop, a standard isolation, the type of player who limp calls 5 big blinds is also the type of player who knows what he's going to do on a king 7-2 flop. He may call with ace 5, and, I don't get to... he will actually get to see all of his equity, is my point there. He may end up seeing 4 or 5 cards in a spot where he kind of quote-unquote shouldn't. And he can fairly easily play me off the best hand if he is playing that loose. Point I'm making that, Fisher, a bit too spastic to want to, push a hand which doesn't flop or turn all that well out of position. So I generally prefer calling here. I have raised hands as weak as 8 out of position, and honestly, I'm, rethinking that. I think even though 8s and 9s have very good equity against these limp calling ranges, I think they really suffer from the same problems as pocket 4s do, just creating too many difficult post-flop situations, and not flopping strong hands frequently enough to the point where I do prefer, particularly 8s, 9s is close, and by 10s I'm happy raising. But, I do prefer to play them more passively, mostly looking to flop a set. any of these fish to fold here. The player who flopped an 8 versus a ton of action, all the draws coming in, refused to give up his hand, and even the player of ace 10, check raised as a bluff or whatever. I could have easily faced, well, that same action on that same board had I raised, and would have likely folded to a flop raise against ace 10. He would have forced me to misplay my hand and fold out my equity. Against these guys, you really just want to be able to have a hand which you could go with, and not be looking to make hero calls with very thin edges against very wide ranges. And we see Lewis again, completely unwilling to fold his hand. He had ace-3 offsuit. I actually sort of missed the turn action just a bit, but I would imagine Refreshing's a good player. If he bet the turn, obviously it's even worse from Lewis, but even if not, it was clear Fishing wasn't bluffing there, and Lewis had a very marginal bluff catcher, which he wasn't folding. So it's great to have position on a player like that. Just going to look for a top pair or better hand, and keep betting with it. And it's really going to be that simple when you're playing against these players. Remember correctly, I suppose it's not the most interesting of spots. This is definitely a hand which I either want to be 4-betting or folding. I guess I'll pause for a second because the jacks may come up as well. Again, it's another line or situation, or however you might want to say it, which I've been experimenting a bit with. Ace-jack, it's very much again, a tweener type hand, and what I mean by that is, if I have ace-king, I'm generally pretty happy for betting, value stacking off, and ace-queen is probably just strong enough to call a 3-bet with. Now, the problem, and it is for similar reasons why calling with ace-jack is somewhat reasonable. Basically, if you expect that your opponent has a very wide 3-bet bluffing range, he may be 3-betting hands which ace-jack dominates, such as, ace-5 suited, or maybe jack-10 suited or not, depending on type of opponent, what sort of a range he 3-bets with, and certainly, the 6-7, 7-8 suited you have great equity against. The problem with ace-jack versus, in particular ace-queen, and really both hands as far as calling 3-bets out of position, you're just going to find yourself check-folding a lot of flops, as well as ace-jack is likely dominated by his entire 3-betting range. Whereas ace-queen all of a sudden has 2 overcards against jacks, as well as if he is actually the type of a player to 3-bet in position with an ace-jack offsuit, as, a bluff slash position raise type bet, the ace queen will dominate it as well. So basically my advice here is that I'm pretty happy using this as my cutoff hand to really never be calling a 3-bet out of position with, I mean I should never say anything that definitive, but extremely infrequently do I want to call a 3-bet out of position with his hand. If you are calling 3-bets out of position, you really want to have hands which can continue very frequently, including, bigger middle pocket pairs and very high card hands, as well as suited value, is going to give you a lot more to continue with. So using this hand is like a 4-bet blocker type bluff if you think your opponent is 3-betting you extremely wide, is going to be fine, but you need to be very careful calling out of position. It is a mistake I've been making a little too frequently recently, basically evaluating the fact that ace-jack is likely a small favorite against his range. Again, this is going to be if your opponent is 3-betting you a lot, and even though for some reason it says I only have 6 hands on refishing, I've played a lot with him and he does 3-bet a lot. But I still think this is going to be generally too weak to call a 3-bet with, particularly given the positions. I also have a good amount of history of technique. I'll go ahead and play it from here, and this is certainly a value 3-bet. He doesn't call a ton of 3-bets, but he 4-bets with a reasonable frequency, including 4-bet folds. So, my plan is definitely to free bet and jam it all in. Occasionally, I'm going to find myself all in again against Ace King, which is nice. I'm going to get a reasonable number of folds, which is nice. And it's pretty unlikely that Ace Queens Kings are aces, but it's certainly yeah, it's certainly part of the equation and is a negative, but I definitely think Jax is strong enough against his entire range there to be free betting and uh, looking to get all in with. Looks like we have a few more folds. There's not too much going on. Um, I suppose I'll discuss my recent play a little bit. To be honest, I haven't played as much as I'd like recently. If you checked out my blog, I did kind of a endurance challenge type of bet, or it was really promotion from a website. So I put in a lot of volume last month before I finally dropped out, and then in the last week or two I've been recovering. So not a ton to talk about there. I suppose I will say, because I have been getting back into playing, it is nice. I almost want to say recreating your game or something along those lines. After you haven't played for a while, just playing less tables and really thinking through situations more clearly. Uh, as opposed to kind of when you are playing every day being a bit more on autopilot. So even if you guys don't want to take a break, which is fine, but if you have been putting in a lot of volume recently and playing every day, I definitely recommend taking some time out to maybe play one or two tables as opposed to whatever you normally play, and think through all your decisions and really kind of evaluate where what standard plays you could kind of add into your game while there's less going on, so that you could easily incorporate it while you are playing a normal 4, 6, 8 table session. So I would imagine this is another spot where I'm looking to bet and go broke. It looks like I'm taking raise outright on the flop line. Here I think I'm ahead of some hands he could be leading out for sure. I have one of the bigger possible aces, assuming he's going to free bet, ace jack, ace queen, ace king with a good amount of high frequency, possibly ace 10 or ace 9 as well. And obviously the draws, and we've seen him get on with all sorts of random crap. If the board were less joy and connecting, I would be happier to call and look to keep calling, because we have seen him bluff off his stack. So there certainly is a lot of value in playing bluff catcher here, but I think raising and both protecting my equity as well as possibly getting all in as a favorite, as opposed to allowing him to realize his equity uh, with whatever he may have, is going to be the better play here. Or I should say, allowing him to realize his equity for free. I raised big. It can be interpreted exactly for what it is, as far as an ace trying to protect its hand, or I assumed a very weak opponent could also view it as me trying to kind of bully him off the pot with a draw. Um, at very least, I did expect him to get stubborn with any pair, so even though, as we saw, he found a fold and he was someone who was both very capable and happy to be bluffing, like I said, due to the board texture, I prefer to just raise as opposed to induce in that spot. Sizing on table one, but not much I'm going to do about it with 2-3 offsuit. Like I said, vast majority of your value from these players is going to be playing strong hands in position uh, and value betting. Um, I did want to discuss this 8-9 suited call here. Close. Obviously, the negative downside or whatever is that Cheese Whiz is extremely short stacked. Well, at least short stacked. If he had more money behind and there was more implied odds as far as hitting a flop goes, I think this is a very clear call. Um, and obviously these two players have been playing just terribly, so I do want to find some excuses to be playing pots. But this was another point I wanted to kind of get across, similar to the ace-jack hand, something which I had been doing too frequently and want to make sure to take out of my game as much as possible is calling out of position with hands trying to hit flops. Now again, this is not something which is always bad, as I kind of discussed with pocket fours hand which hits flops very clearly. I almost want to say definitively. On a king 7-4 flop, you basically flop the nuts, whereas 8-9 suited will more often flop a straight draw or a flush draw, which is far from the nuts. And extremely rarely flop straights and flushes. Under the logic, if I'm trying to just flop a straight or a flush, I could really call with anything. Its value. This hand's value is that it can continue very frequently, but given that it doesn't actually flop extremely well very frequently, you could make a pretty reasonable argument for a fold here. I don't like a pre-bet at all, given, I'm not ahead of their range, and I don't have fold equity. um, like I said, calling these are very poor opponents, and we do want to find some excuses to call, and it is just a blind or two, but, too frequently you're putting in a blind or two here and there and just check folding a flop. So again, if you're doing this very frequently, and I believe I was doing it too frequently at this time, this slightly older video as I mentioned before, definitely look to eliminate it as much as reasonably possible from your game. However, with that being said, there is still a time and a place to try to hit a flop. Just make sure that your implied odds are good, and certainly you want to be doing it with the hands which will flop well enough, which tend to be maybe even bigger suited connectors. Which have considerably more top pair value, something like a Queen Jack suited, as well as I said, pocket pairs really allow you to comfortably win stacks when they hit flops. So if there's enough money behind, you certainly want to be calling with them. I don't know about all the time, but most of the time for sure. So it looks like, I opted to play the Jack 10 suited from under the gun. I'll pause. I don't remember what I do here, so I'll pause and kind of give you guys what my thought process is now, while kind of more objectively looking at this session well after the fact. So one good thing about this board is that I'm basically the only one who could represent a big hand here. I don't think anyone could have aces, kings, ace, king. There are a couple combos of pocket fives, but it's extremely unlikely. As well as I certainly have my backdoor backdoor flush draw and inside straight draw. So I have, a reasonable bit of equity, and I could tell a very convincing story raising this flop here. And certainly the next option would just be calling this flop, getting a pretty reasonable price. Downside of calling is that I'm putting my hand face up as somewhat marginal, something which doesn't want to go with it. Certainly if I had aces, kings, ace, king here, I'd want to raise this flop for value and protection. So when I call here, it makes it, easier for I8 bet to raise a somewhat marginal hand, which maybe outright folds to my raise. So for example, if I make it 8 here and I 8 bet is sitting there with like an ace 4 of hearts, he's pretty likely to just fold. As well as it takes away the play from Cheese Whiz in a similar type of situation, although I don't think he'll ever fold ace 4, period. But, let's say he has Queen Jack. Against a bet of 2, a call, I 8-bet folds, Cheese Whiz might stick in his last $12 expecting to get some folds, whereas I don't know that I'll call off all his money with an inside straight draw really pretty good. I think I get blown off the hand a bit too frequently. A raise is a strong play. I don't know how much fold equity I have against Lewis. It really just comes down to that. And he has shown a complete inability to fold any sort of a hand here. So, after my full analysis, I think I just want to see me fold right here, even though I have more equity than I would like to fold, getting 4-1. I think given relative position and all the players in the pot, the situation in total, I just don't have any sort of a good way to realize this equity. And it looks like I do call and take my 4-1. And am forced to fold that turn without, picking up my spades or obviously my straight. So as I said, I think the flop call is just a bit too loose. Obviously, I was getting a good price, and it's not like the two players behind me, clearly, they're not raising all the time. So the play isn't horrible, but I think it's another example of me playing a bit too passively, as I was falling into the pattern of doing and trying to hit hands, more than deciding earlier on and either playing the hand aggressively, raising the flop, or just getting out of the way instead of trying to hit a 3 or 4 outer, depending how you want to consider the diamond being in that spot. I suppose I'm just check folding the river at this point. Again, this hand played out a bit odd. I think I prefer a slightly bigger flop bet to, again, kind of a value protection type thing. There are a good amount of worse hands which can call. Also, when I min bet this flop, I think I put myself in these difficult later street situations. I think I should just bet the turn. When my opponent calls that flop min bet, I don't think he has a queen with all that much of a frequency. He could have, more or less anything, and I think the turn is another spot to consider it a semi-bluff. I'm likely ahead of any sort of a range he can have. I do want to fold, so it certainly has to be considered somewhere in the bluff range. I likely have 3 10 outs and 2 5 outs, so 5 outs against most of his calling range, which has me beat, as well as, there's a lot of value if he just floated this flop of, say, ace-7. I'd much rather have it fold the turn, and again, he may have also, I'll say I call, he may have also floated the flop with, say a hand like Jack-10, which again is going to have plenty of equity, and I prefer to fold out. So I don't think I like my river call there. I would imagine my thought process... Oh, I do remember my thought process. It was essentially... I was pretty sure that he would bet queens on the turn, and I felt there was a very large likelihood that he would raise the flop with a flush draw, and I also thought his flop calling range would be extremely too wide. Like I said, hands like ace-7, over 7 got there on the river, ace-8, same thing. King-jack, just whatever he had, would more or less call a flop min bet. So I took queens out of his range because I felt they were raising the flop with some frequency and betting the turn with an even larger frequency, and similar enough about his spade draws. So his line was extremely suspicious to me. He turned out just to have a queen bow. It's a very thin call, for sure, if just a pair of 5s in that spot. I think it's the type of situation where I don't mind just recognizing that all reasonable hands came in. It's possible for him to have something which is, a bit less on the reasonable side, but it could still be in his range, like, say, 7-8, which he just decides to bet, which also has me beat. I suppose what I'm trying to say here is I just we see it's extremely difficult to hand read against fish. They will just do things which you didn't expect they would do under kind of standard hand reading type examples. And, as I was kind of stressing before, the best adjustment, in my opinion, to bet against these really weak players is just simply call and or bet with your stronger hands and fold, give up, however it might be when your hand just doesn't beat all that much. It looks like we were considering checking his attempt to steal. I'm not sure what it is. You know, again, this is another situation I very much encourage players to be extremely aggressive in the big blind versus blind, and sticky and stay in the pot call with some hands which can flop reasonably and re-raise with some others. But the in addition to that, you're also going to need to make sure that you are giving yourself as many opportunities as possible to win the pot if you are going to call with a marginal hand, like an h6 offsuit. Uh, so calling pre-flop of a hand which it's behind his range. It's just that simple. Even though I am getting a good price and I am in position, but h6 does not beat anything. And checking and well, I would imagine giving up on this flop. I just haven't given myself much of an opportunity to find a plus EV situation. The call pre-flop is likely, marginally plus EV given that I'm getting a price on my call. But if I'm not realizing that equity, I'm not stealing the pot, all of a sudden I'm just putting in money similar enough to that ace-jack situation where I talked about putting in money and folding. This is going to be another situation where even if a few of the earlier street decisions are somewhat reasonable and plus EV, if you are just giving up and not seeing any of that equity and check folding too frequently, or in this case, just not betting when check to and either losing the pot because I lose to everything, or folding if he bets. Again, you're going to find these plays aren't particularly plus EV. Bet with as well as defend, and 8-6 offsuit doesn't have to be one of them unless they're really attacking 50, 60, 70% of the time or something like that. It looked like I considered a turn overbet. I don't think my opponent has a flush here ever, or a straight. A straight is halfway reasonable for me. I mean, if I have 8-6 offsuit, I could probably have 5-6 suit or offsuit. I'm pretty likely to bet for flop though with any straight draw, any flush draw, any queens. So queens are pretty far out of my range. Spades are likely out of my range, and straights are likely out of my range. Again, another situation where had I bet an earlier straight, all of a sudden barreling would make a lot more sense. But I played this hand passively again and didn't really give myself much of an opportunity to win. I'm imagining I'll bet here. I hope I do. Yeah, I should bet there. Again, to give myself a thought process and what I believe it was at that time is I really just didn't think I could credibly represent anything and was very afraid of being looked up too light. However, if I am gonna have any sort of a value hand in this spot or a hand with showdown value, it is pretty likely to be a 4. I'm trying to consider whether I would actually bet a 4 on the flop or not. The fact of the matter is it doesn't make a ton of a difference in his mind, in my perceived range. If I check twice and then bet this river, it's going to look a lot like a 4, and it's at least somewhat reasonable, and literally every hand... Oh, do I beat anything with 8-6 offsuit? I suppose I beat 5-7. I lose to almost every possible hand he could have. I'm gonna fold out king highs, jack highs, 10 highs. Should be a somewhat reasonable part of his range. I don't know if he'll fold ace high. I think he will fold king high. I don't imagine he was planning on check calling this river, though. It's not outrageous at all from him. When I do bet that river, I'm representing a 4 or something worse than king high. So there's some chance he would find a call. And if that is the situation, if that's the case, well then my check behind was actually well, more reasonable, given that he's going to call a lot. I still think there's enough in his range, which will fold, to want to bluff when I have nothing there. So I would say, as far as this video goes, that's got to be the hand I'm most disappointed in myself watching. Definitely a situation where I need to be putting some pressure on my opponent, particularly if he is checking the Queen 4-2 flop with King 7. It's just a spot where his range is weak on the flop when he checks, and I need to be putting pressure on it. Or I suppose I should add, I'm not sure how good a read I had on him at the time, but now that I have actually seen a showdown, I know that he can be checking with a very weak range in a spot like that, just looking to check and give up. So now if I am defending blind versus blind and that opponent checks, I'm going to be less concerned of kind of a more standard line. Say, for example, he opened from under the gun and he checked a Queen 4-2 flop. I'd be very suspicious that he had jacks or tens, hand which was looking to call once and evaluate. Looks like I'm having difficulty checking out my HUD. But that obviously changes a lot blind versus blind, where his range isn't going to be as strong. He's going to have hands like King 7 suited, which he just won't have in the other example. So, by definition, he's going to have to be giving up a lot more frequently. Looks like we lost a couple of our weak opponents on table 2, which is too bad that I wasn't able to get their stack, but they both certainly played their hands fine. I was going to say about the situation with the Queen Jack offsuit, I am going to be heavily influenced by this weaker opponent's raise sizing. If he raised small, I would 3-bet it. If he raised to a normal size, 3 or 4x, I would likely call. And at the 5x, I'm going to go ahead and fold and trust that he's playing his hands for what they are. Meaning, if he 5x, he has a stronger range. If he min raises, he has a weaker range. This isn't universally true at all. I find it very commonly true with fish, but you certainly want to try, get as much evidence as you can of this before really committing to this read. Calling 5 big blinds with Queen Jack offsuit is still pretty loose. So I have no problem folding even if I am in position against a very weak opponent. It's just not a hand which will give me too many favorable post-flop opportunities unless I'm, extremely happy calling down on like a Jack 7-2 flop, and I wouldn't be. So I am happy finding this fold, and as I was discussing a bit or starting to get into, sometimes you'll also see that a player like this has like 7-2 offsuit right here. They like to make it really big when they're bluffing and show and just kind of mess around. Again, something you want to be aware of and take that note whenever you're able to find it. Obviously, in this situation, I don't know what he had, but I am happy taking the more cautious route and waiting for a better situation to bust this guy. Alright, let's see if we get any action on table 2. I don't remember this hand, so unfortunately it likely means I don't. But let's take a look. And we see on table one, Lewis over here does have an open min-raising range, which makes me feel a bit better about that Queen-Jack offsuit fold. Definitely, I think it's the right play. There are a couple theories about attacking fish. One of them basically being really going out of your way to play anything reasonable, particularly if you are in position. So some of you guys out there may find that Queen Jack fold to be particularly tight. I gave you all my reasons for it, but certainly if you believe strongly the other way, I could certainly see a case for wanting to play your hand in that situation. Definitely feel free to write any comment, question, comments, feedback, if read. And I limp with 7, so let me kind of discuss what I'm thinking as far as the Queen Jack goes. Kind of the point I wanted to make is it seems like I did have a reasonable read on this guy, that he would just have a stronger hand when he 5x'd it, and I will defend my fold for that reason. Pocket 7s here, even though I don't have any fold equity, I think there's a lot of value in isolating, getting heads up. His hand's going to be a lot easier to play in position than, again, that's similar for his hand at the beginning of the video, out of position. I think this is a clear raise. I have no idea why I did this, to be perfectly honest. I more or less always raise in this situation. The times I win, on occasion, I will limp behind with a smaller, even up to 7's pocket pair, which is basically still a small pair. The couple concerns would be if I think I'm getting 3-bet a ton from the blinds and I rather just limp call along with the fish, or if I expect the fish will limp re-raise with any sort of a frequency, but I have no real reason to believe either one of these things, so I much prefer an isolation. And we see this is obviously the other reason why limping behind is not great. We see, I 8-bet just took the play away from me. He knows that I don't have much. I would imagine he still has to have somewhat of a reasonably strong range here, given how infrequently Lewis folds, and he likely realized that, but it's too difficult to make any assumption based on this, how observant he is. If I knew he had to have aces or kings here and really just wouldn't mess with Lewis at all, I would call, but honestly, that's ridiculous. His range is certainly going to be wider than that, but not so wide that I want to play back. I'm really just handcuffed to the point where I feel like I'm forced to fold there. I should say forced to fold there. Heads up. Had the fish called, I certainly, even though the raise sizing is a bit bigger than I like pre-flop, given my relative position, I 8-bet is going to c-bet a lot, and this fish, what was his name again? Lewis over here is going to call pretty frequently on that flop. If he had limp called 6 big blinds, it would put me in a situation when I do flop a set, I could very reasonably make a lot of money, but heads up, that's considerably less the case. King Queen suited, it looked like I opted to defend in position, as we see and discussed a bit before. Chikanika folds to a lot of free bets. So King Queen suited is definitely the type of hand which, as we see, can continue on a lot of flops, even a low card flop. I was able to flop 2 overs and a flush draw. Definitely not a hand which I'm looking to free bet and stack off with, and I believed it to be a bit too thin to free bet for value, given his high fold to free bet. I do take the stab at this board. Given what we learned before, I expect Chikanika can be check folding with pretty good frequency. But I simply have a lot more equity, and, well, I considered it a big mistake not betting before, so I still think not betting King Queen here would be a mistake. Again, same reasons. Looking at his range, folding out ace highs would be great. Getting called is never a disaster, given how much equity I have, and it is not. Even folding out King Jack is a win for me. It takes away his 10% equity, so. I'm happy when he folds hands which I have extremely dominated. When he check calls here, I think I'm going to bet again on the turn. A combination of pot equity and fold equity. I don't think it's impossible for him to have a 7, but as we see again, when I start playing the hand aggressively earlier on, I can more credibly represent more hands. It's just that simple. So by betting that flop, I can now have 7s in my range. Unfortunately, so can he, but I'll likely know about it on the turn, and if he does check raise in a spot where I can have 7-6 or 6-6 or 3-3 or just Queen 7 suited, where my range is uncapped, then I can pretty confidently give him credit for actually having a hand and wouldn't have much of a problem at all bet folding just a king high flush draw. So certainly in that hand versus the 8-6 hand, it's much easier to bet and continue to barrel when you actually have equity, when you have that fallback of being able to win the pot even when your opponent calls you with a pretty high frequency. But even without equity, if your opponent is giving up, and you have reason to believe that your opponent is giving up, certainly you should be looking to take the pot away, especially if you have absolutely no way to win, if your hand is that weak that it more or less loses to everything. So I'm about halfway through this video. I'll go for a few minutes longer here, maybe approximately reach that halfway point, and then I'll decide whether I want to make a part 2 or not. As I mentioned before, when I first recorded this video, I was very concerned that there weren't enough interesting spots, and there has been a few points of downtime for sure. But I think in all, first off, this has been a nice exercise for me to review my play, which is certainly good on my end, and I think these spots have been interesting enough that I definitely hope you guys are getting something out of it. Here on table 1, we see that I'm making a nice adjustment or whatever. I do agree with this play. We know Lewis can limp fold to this raise sizing, and certainly, as I discussed before, King Queen is the type of hand which is just going to flop better than a lot of other hands I could choose to raise here, and that it's going to flop a lot of top pairs, which I'm happy to keep betting for value, as well as overcards, which it looks like I'd give up. I prefer a bet on the flop. Again, my thought process simply must just be that I don't think I'm getting enough folds on 8-2-2, given that my opponent is outrageously loose. And it's a factor. There is no doubt that I need to factor that in. But given that it's so difficult for my opponent to actually have anything here, I've represented a strong hand to begin with, and I think in this type of situation I want to just play exploitably and obviously and bet bigger when I don't have it in order to get more folds, and kind of frequently bet a bit smaller when I do have it, and be concerned about keeping him in the pot. Or I suppose the point that I'm making is I want to tailor my bet sizings to his ranges and how I expect him to react. And I think if I bet 5 or 550 on this board, he's just going to look at Jack 10 and give up and say, well, Whirleymob made it huge pre-flop, he's now betting very big on the flop. He's going to kind of view the hand as he would play it himself and say, I likely have 2 aces, and I think he'll just fold. A very large percentage of his range, especially given the fact that, well, it's such a low, dry flop. It's near impossible for him to have a piece. And again, as I've discussed, you'd always want to be thinking about what you're folding out. I think I could fold out some better hands, and even when I'm not folding out better hands, that is good as well. So I think there's another spot where I'm playing too passively. I suppose I just didn't want to barrel many turn cards when I got called here, which I think is fair. If I do take the plan, which I like, which is betting big on this flop again, representing a very big hand, trying to play into the vicious psychology, I would not barrel any non-king or queen turn. I would have to expect that when my opponent calls that flop, he's going to have something like 3s through 7s, which are just getting stubborn, and I expect they're just too frequently getting stubborn on later streets, as well as like an 8-9 type hand. So this is definitely a spot where I much prefer betting once, and again, this is certainly a situation where I have equity to back up my hand. It's just my king or queen out are good so frequently. I like considering this the flop bet. A very standard semi-bluff. Again, I'm very disappointed in myself taking a passive line against a fish this time. Again, I could see some sort of a reasonable, logical reason for it. I just simply didn't expect that I was getting enough folds, but I think it's a hand reading, game flow, however you might want to call it, error. I do think if I bet bigger, I will get enough folds. Again, given how difficult it is for my opponent to have anything there, and how credible my story is if I just bet big on the flop, I think betting is going to almost certainly be plus EV. Actually, betting is certainly going to be plus EV there. So definitely if you do make that large ISO, even against a very loose call stationy fish, assuming you don't have some sort of a ridiculous dynamic where you've raised him 15 times in a row or anything, definitely go ahead and c-bet there. And like I said, it depends how you want to evaluate how the fish will think, but for the most part, bet bigger and expect that they're going to read that as a stronger hand than if you bet smaller. Kind of level 1 type thinking against a weaker opponent. So I did just about hit that halfway point here, and we don't have any interesting hands going on, so I'm going to pause it and leave it at that. Definitely, as always, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback on any part of this video, leave that in the thread. Also, give me some idea if you liked this video and are curious about seeing a part 2, or would rather see me move on to either a live video or a different set of footage. Or I also have a few presentation type videos in my mind and in the works. So if you rather see that, also let me know. So definitely hope you guys enjoyed it and learned something. This has been Neil Gewirtz with BluefirePoker.com.